Good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Sands, and I'm director of the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And I'm doubly blessed because I'm also a member of the Executive Council of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, an institution that I've been involved with over the years pretty regularly, thanks to the great Jim Blanchard, my former boss, always my boss in some ways, who brought me into the organization. It is an absolutely unique institution in the Canada-U.S. relationship, a joint institute for the study of legal issues in the Canada-U.S. relationship, co-sponsored by Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and Western Ontario University, or just Western as they sometimes go by, in beautiful London, Ontario. It had its origins in a man named Henry King, who was a Nuremberg prosecutor, who found himself at Case Western doing law, and also Sidney Picker. Now, both of them have passed, but Sidney Picker was an outstanding scholar of international law and is still very well regarded in the legal community. So that's the august beginnings. I now want to introduce you to the U.S. Managing Director of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, Steve Petras, will get us started this morning. But welcome.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everybody to our annual experts meeting in Washington, D.C. this year on critical minerals. And I want to just give a brief introduction to certain people that we should say thank you to. Of course, number one is Christopher Sands and allowing us to tag team this event with the Canada Institute of the Wilson Center, which Chris is the executive director. And also, special thanks today goes out to James Graham, Chief Legal Officer of Cleveland Cliffs. Cleveland Cliffs is the sponsor of our luncheon today, so everybody gets a lunch today, and we can thank James for that. Much appreciated. He's on our executive committee. And as Chris mentioned, we have two co-chairs of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. We have Jim Blanchard, former congressman, former governor of Michigan, and former U.S. ambassador to Canada. And we have Jim Peterson, former Minister of International Trade for Canada. And additionally, we have two presidents, the Dean of the Law Faculty at Western Ontario, Erica Chamberlain, and the co-dean of Case Western Reserve Law School, Michael Scharf. So on behalf of all of those and our whole executive committee, welcome. So today, we're going to talk about critical minerals, and this is something that the executive committee was very concerned about. So I'm going to just set the stage very quickly. It was actually an issue that the government was concerned about for many, many years. And in 2017, President Trump said, well, we better look seriously at this, and he issued an executive order, and he wanted some analysis done. And it's interesting because the assignment was given to the Department of Interior, and then the U.S. Geological Survey actually was asked to come up with the list of critical minerals, and they were wondering, well, what do we include? So they included minerals that are very important for the production of products in the United States, have strategic value, and are subject to stress or challenge in their supply chains. Just this February, the U.S. Geological Survey published a report and listed 50 critical minerals on that list. Many of them, of course, you know about, things like lithium and cobalt, etc. But then there are a lot of others that are, nobody understands except chemists, and they're known as rare earth metals or platinum metals. It's interesting, of those 50, the Department of Energy was asked to comment upon the sustainable supply of 35 of those mineral commodities. And of those 35, they found out that 14, there was no U.S. domestic production of those at all. And 31 of those 50, the U.S. is more than 50% reliant on imports. And in fact, of those 31, 15 are 100% reliant on imports. So the question is, well, why is this a big deal? Well, according to the International Energy Agency, if we are to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, we're going to need 6 times the amount of critical minerals that are being produced today by 2040. And also, according to them, it takes a lot of lead time to come up with that. And so you look at things like electrification, wind turbines, and all of that, and you see that the amount of critical minerals that go into these new vehicles, for example, are huge compared to combustion engines, where you almost hardly needed any critical minerals. And just to give you an example, a single wind turbine typically requires about a ton of rare earth minerals, in addition to 3 metric tons of copper. So today we're going to figure out, well, what do we do? What does Canada and the United States do about critical minerals? And our first panel, we're going to have 2 panels. We're going to have an industry panel, and then we're going to have a government policy panel. Then we're going to take a break. Each panel is going to run about an hour. Then we'll take a short break and move over to the cafeteria, where we're going to have a luncheon presentation by Matthew Lanowski, who is with the Department of Defense, responsible for the supply of critical minerals. So to kick us off, we will start out with our industry panel. And our moderator is our own executive committee member, Diane Francis. Diane is a noted reporter, investigative reporter, and journalist and columnist. She's actually an American, but she lives in Canada. So she claims, loyalty to both countries. And she's been publishing very interesting articles and blogs about what's going on in the Ukraine, what's going on in the election. Just today she wrote a column that's called Midtermination. So anyway, without further ado, to introduce her panel, Diane.
Thank you. I have 2 passports, by the way. I'm proud of that. You set it up beautifully, so you kind of know that we have these critical minerals that are absolutely essential to moving forward in terms of creating renewable energy products and so on, and to reduce emissions. I'm going to give you an overview, and then I'm going to go to our panel, who are in the trenches, so to speak. They're in the private sector dealing with all these things. But first of all, the big overview and the trends, the overview of what's going on. I've covered for 50 years journalism, business, mining, energy, and finance, and politics in Canada and around the world. Canada is a major commodity nation. We have just about everything there is to have, but we don't produce a lot of it for a lot of different reasons. And so we've always taken a big interest in Canada in mining and commodities, and I've been on the board of directors of 2 publicly listed gold companies and on private sector unlisted mining companies looking for some of these rare earth commodities. So the big picture that overhangs all of this, I'm going to start with that. First of all, Russia is the biggest commodity-rich country in the world. And by their own doing, they're now offline in terms of the commodity supply situation. This is because either they can't do it, or because of sanctions, or because of permanent bans as a result of the murder and mayhem that they've been undertaking. They don't have the capability of doing it. They were very reliant on foreign investment and in foreign talent, and for just about everything that they do, whether it's Arctic LNG or whether it's their mines in Siberia, and so on. So that's a very important thing, and that, of course, has driven the inflation of all commodity prices, because they're also a big food manufacturer and farm manufacturer. So when you take, maybe one of the major commodity producing economies off grid, then everybody else has got to scramble and make up, and that's made the prices rise and will keep them high, because I think Russia's going to go through some cataclysmic change once Ukraine wins. So that's Russia. The other big commodity producing nations are Canada, Australia, the United States, and Brazil. And so they will be, and this is food as well as metals, minerals, and fossil fuels in the case of Canada and the United States. China is also another big overhanging factor in all of this. China has strategically targeted rare earths and other precious commodities that are essential for producing technologies and manufactured products that they have specialized in. Very smart. They didn't have a lot of this stuff in their own country, so they went out and got some. They did it through mining deals. They did it through swapping. I'll build you a railroad if you give me a cobalt deposit, that kind of thing, through the Belt and Road Initiative. Very, very smart, very strategic, and they have an enormous appetite for this stuff. Do they have a lock on a lot of it? Can they control the supply of a lot of it? I don't think they quite have the kind of lock on some of these materials that, say, for instance, OPEC has over oil. But they are very important and very prominent and very difficult to deal with. On the other hand, China now, this is the other overhanging situation, is going through, I think, a very difficult period ahead. They call it peak China. I think China's peaked economically. And geopolitically because of Xi's friendship with Putin. And, you know, that's like I said in one column, imagine taking a selfie with your best friend and declaring you're going to love him for life, and 3 days later he invades the country. So this is his problem. It's certainly been a bad mark on his judgment and a problem for China. And of course, China has been meticulously careful not to help the war effort at all, which has again alienated him from his pal. And so it's not orphaned, but it's got some challenges. The other challenges it has is it has staggering debt. Staggering debt. Probably the highest indebtedness per capita or per GDP of any country in the world now. That's because of the COVID lockdowns, which have really impacted negatively their economy and their reputation as a supply chain supplier. Some of that business never came back even after the lockdown stopped. They have a real estate bubble that is horrifying, much bigger than the 2008 mortgage problem that the United States had that nearly brought down the global economy. But China is still very rich and has been a saver. So they're able to manage a lot of this, but the real estate bubble is so large that it really threatens the net worth of virtually their entire middle class, which they've worked 40 years to create, faster than any country in the world has done, to their credit. It's an amazing country in many respects. So that's the issue. The United States, I think, is chugging along. That's noisy. It's unruly, but it's the most incredible economy the world's ever known, and I think it's going to stay that way. That's a personal opinion. Dynamic and amazing and able to evaluate quickly and move on a dime, and has great capital markets and a reserve currency. The other factors, though, that overhang everything is what happened to supply chains as a result of COVID. That broke the supply chain, and actually broke it's led to the deglobalization in terms of trade and in many ways, because people couldn't rely. Then they suddenly started to realize if they can't get masks for their hospitals, what about critical minerals to build our cars? And that's all done in China. We better change stuff, and let's do it now and quickly. So that's created a huge dislocation all across. Then the war in Russia changed the supply chains again. There were things that were coming out of Russia that, oh, we got to get it somewhere else, or we hate them, they're terrible people, we can't buy their stuff. Oh, there's sanctions, we'll get in trouble if we do. All of that is another readjustment. And then the drumbeat behind everything is the incredible technological advances that are underway, mostly coming out of the United States. And these are in the renewable energy field, whether it's electric cars, battery technology, biotech, pharma tech. It's quite dazzling how quickly the world is changing, and that means a complete restructuring of inventory. I mean, you got to get the good robot instead of the old robot. You got to get the new pharma instead of the old pharma. So that's another dislocating but vibrant situation going on. And all of this impacts commodities, all the way down to what we're going to talk about today, the critical ones, in particular because they are in greater demand than before. So that's the overlying picture. The issues, and I'm going to turn first, we have two guys here. Eric Lee is on the consulting side. He's a geologist. Originally, he's been in the car, automobile manufacturing, electrification worlds. He's based out of Michigan, and he's going to address, in light of all these overhangs, what he sees happening in the private sector world. And also, if you don't mind, Eric, commenting on what governments are not doing to help, because the other issues is security, geopolitical cost, and environmental concerns. So over to you, Eric. He's CEO of Copper Country Capital.
Thank you, Diana. So one of the things I'd just like to say is that for those of us that have been in the mobility field, this is the most exciting time since the invention of the internal combustion engine. It just is. You're watching a seismic shift in not only how people move, but what they move in, and also how they're going to get there. And we're doing this all under the backdrop of removing carbon from the equation. So my career arc is somewhat eclectic. I'm a geological engineer by degree, so my buddy Chris here is doing the work that I thought I was going to start off doing, but commodity prices collapsed. Right now they're on a high, and I ended up doing a quick pivot into sustainability and environmental engineering, which got me into alternative fuels, which got me into hydrogen fuel cells, which got me into electrification. At the end of it, I was working for a major OEM, who I'm not representing today, but a major OEM doing a global electrification strategy. So I literally had a soup to nuts view of, getting stuff out of the ground, the utilities that serve electrification, and the vehicles that they go into. And that gives me some different perspectives on this. It's more of a ability to zoom up, but then also focus on the details that matter. And I heard a great phrase yesterday in this very room, but it was the tyranny of details and how they can make life difficult. And that's some of the challenges that I think Diane articulated incredibly well on what's changed. And I'll say the last 10 years, but especially in the last couple of years, I think the pandemic really highlighted the fragility of the global commodity and supply chain network. And every single private entity on the planet has a purchasing department whose sole mission is to drive cost out of the system, which means that you're aggregating things into one spot to get economies of scale. You're going to the lowest cost country for supply solutions. But what we learned is, and we've learned this lesson a couple of times and it repeats itself, is that, it can take a 27-cent part to shut down a plant that's the size of most cities, okay? And so there's a danger when you spread things out that much. So I think some governments have gotten the message. They put it in local content. That's one play on that is providing capital and resources and employment at home, but it also helps de-risk the system. One of the conversations that I had with some of the other panelists before getting up here is we were talking about, right now we're going through an inflation spike, but if we keep the lessons learned of this and we don't aggregate all our sourcing into just low-cost solutions, what does that do to the costs overall? So instead of having 2 or 3 suppliers do something, you got a couple of dozen spread out geographically. does pricing ever come down to where it was? And I think the short answer is no. But these are challenges, but let's talk about the opportunities. Bloomberg has cited that over the next, up to 2050, from today to 2050, that e-mobility, electrification, and I'm talking not just of vehicles, but of the infrastructure required to support it and all the technology that would enable it, that you're looking at a $53 trillion opportunity. Trillion, that's a T, 53. And that explains, by the way, why you see thousands of startups in many countries trying to capitalize on the opportunity. Because challenges, adversity just create an opportunity, and I think that is one of the more exciting things. Because you got to remember, if you, I was talking to my former governor, Jim Blanchard, over there. We grew up in what I'll call the Rust Belt era days, and you look at the way things used to be. You can't be that way anymore. We have some, I'll call it West Coast contingents, the new automotive OEMs, and then you have a ton of startups that are all working towards a 100% electrified solution. So one of the things I would just ask you to think about is that, when somebody says to, I'll say, a legacy OEM, what's a legacy OEM? Somebody that's been in business, for close to 100 years, that has an internal combustion heritage. Why don't they go all electric yesterday? Well, the thing is, it's called stranded capital. It's called that electrification doesn't solve every use case. It's getting better, and technology will enable it to solve more. But right now it's forecasted that by somewhere between 2040 and 2050, the global passenger vehicle fleet will then be overtaken by battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So, internal combustion is going to be around, but you're looking at a multi-trillion-dollar shift into electrification. So that's going to create some angst, and it's going to create a lot of opportunity. And there's also going to be a gap between wealthy nations and emerging economies. Some of that will be due to cost structure. Some of that will be due to they have different solutions to get to a low carbon, no carbon. Brazil, for instance, with alcohol fuels. They're going to focus on that. It doesn't mean that they won't have electrification, but they're going to use a different set of tools to get there. Other things to think about is that electrification is not a peanut butter approach to transportation needs. Certain transportation, for instance, heavy duty, has a hard time with batteries. Well, why is that? It sounds like if you're pulling something heavy with an electric motor, which is what trains do, they use diesel to power an electric motor, you have 100% torque at 0 RPM. It's the perfect solution, except when you have to put a battery on it, it starts cannibalizing some of the functionality of the vehicle, towing capacity, payload, things like that. So there's going to be a need for different solutions for propulsion technologies, just like today. It'll be different parts of the pie, but instead of being diesel and gasoline, it might be diesel and hydrogen fuel cells, okay, for heavy-duty applications. And then, the companies that take us there, if they're new, they're going straight to dedicated architectures. What does the phrase dedicated architectures mean? It means that it's built with the premise that it's 100% electric all the time. If you're a legacy OEM, you're probably going to have a dual path approach where you'll have a dedicated architecture, strategically outlined but tactically executed on a cross-platform volume player. But there's some things that you're going to still need to have some kind of internal combustion component to it. So they might have more of a hybrid or PHEV solution. In your head, if you're going, well, that's a lot of fancy talk, what exactly does that mean? let's put it in kind of a Midwesterner, I'm driving up north to go snowmobiling scenario, okay? You can have a Tesla pickup truck, you can have the Ford Lightning, you can have all these. But until infrastructure catches up with the vehicle and the charging times come down, there's going to be certain end applications where it might be handy to have both electric and also an internal combustion component so that you can pull your car through with a trailer, fill up quickly, and keep going up north. More of a charge when you want to, not when you need to scenario. So that's, all these things, by the way, from a critical materials, still have big batteries. So they're going to need lithium. They're going to need copper. They're going to need cobalt and nickel and all the other strategic metals. You know, the mega trend that's sitting on top of all this as we look at transportation is that, you know, when I hopped on the planet, it was roughly 3.1 billion people on the planet, okay? Today, I think we're right around 8 billion. Now, most of the projections show that it's starting to go somewhat asymptotic and that by 2062, it would be somewhere over 10 billion, between 10 and 11 billion. So, you know, it's sheer folly to think that everything that we've done historically, when you have more people and on average using more resources per person, can stay the same. And, you know, there's an old saying that everything that you use has either been mined or grown. So the chairs, the clothes you wear, you know, the plane you hopped on to get here, you know, the aluminum came out of the ground, you know, the land was, you know, exploited for that. So there's nothing that we can do that doesn't have a footprint, but we need to be judicious and we need to be thoughtful as we move forward, because as more people hop onto this planet, we're going to have to, if we want to maintain this kind of lifestyle, be more efficient. And that's one of the things that electrification can do for us, because it's a lot easier to move electrons around in general for most applications than it is to use fossil fuels if you get the storage solution down. The other part of this is that, you know, on the government side, one of the charts I used to explain when people go, is it real this time, is a chart of all the megafactories that are being built up, you know, or gigafactories, I'm sorry, for building batteries. There's, as of last year, between the plants that are already built and the ones that are in construction or planned to start being built within 18 months, there was over 300 gigafactories in production. I mean, that's amazing. 10 years ago, there was zero, or close to zero, maybe one. You know, it's real this time, so it's going to happen. And when you look at going to a low carbon, no carbon scenario, it takes a real fundamental shift on how we look at our resources. Diana and Chris and I were talking just before this kicked off, and you know, one of the points is, and she highlighted in the resources in Russia and, you know, South America and Australia and all that. All these resources were put there before humans were on the planet, okay? We came on the planet and we scribbled little lines saying, this is mine, this is yours. You can't control where mineralization happens. And I don't think we understand where all the mineralization is yet. I mean, we frankly, just in exploration times, just started looking for some of these in earnest now, because we realize, and the phrase critical is absolutely correct, how critical they are. So that's something that I think that I'm encouraged to hear, that there's been more activity to have a more thoughtful approach to developing relationships that can get us to a low carbon / no carbon solution. And, you know, there's some old metals that we use today, copper being one of them, that are going to have to do double duty. They're going to be in the vehicle. A nice vehicle, you know, can have between 30 and 50 pounds of copper in it. A PHEV or a BEV could have 3 to 4 times that amount. All right? And the infrastructure that is required to support these vehicles is going to require copper. And when you think about how copper is used, it goes in and it's very recyclable. That's the good news. But a lot of these applications it's going into, for instance, on the infrastructure side of the house, it's going to be there for 30 to 50 years. So it's not going to be back in the system soon. So there's maybe not a copper crisis per se, but the timeline to develop a copper mine can be between 1 and 2 decades. So if you plan on hitting your 2025 or 2030 or 2035 goals, you better start having your team putting together the preliminary economic analysis and start doing, what it takes to develop a mine. And one of the things, Diane, you asked to comment on just some of the challenges that we see with governments. These mines run for long periods of times. They're in areas with emerging economies with maybe not the most stable governments. And so you're asking companies to go in and make multi-billion-dollar investments / bets that what they do isn't going to be nationalized or is going to be a resource that they can do. I think that's kind of what slows some of that, but we're going to need to figure out how to speed that up. And then, lastly, I'd just like to point out that, Steve, you brought up the point on the list of critical materials, and, I applaud them for kind of, making a list of prioritization. But, one of the concerns I think we all have is that, if we make something and we also we get it here and we get it somewhere else, there's negotiation. If we can't get it here, it's tough to negotiate. So we got to look at that. So I started hearing the music playing, so I'll be quiet now.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of things which we won't get into it now, but maybe later, but maybe some of the audience can pick up on this. I see the big impediments to electrification. NIMBY, not in my backyard. It's now become banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. And we see this as a commodity nation in Canada. So pipelines are hard enough to get approved. Transmission lines are even harder. And building out a grid to accommodate even a doubling of the electric cars in the country is going to be a daunting, probably impossible task, unless it's part of a national security emergency effort, kind of almost a wartime thing. So that's something to also consider. Now we're going to turn to Chris Doornbos. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
It's R. Doornbos. Okay, he's CEO of E3 Lithium. It's kind of a funny beast to Americans. We were talking before. I'm trying to explain to Eric that most of our resource industries are built on the basis of federally owned subsurface mineral rights with permissions and licenses, or done in partnership with governments, and private sector comes in to provide technology, capital markets, that sort of thing. So he's going to hopefully explain. It's kind of hard for, I think, the Americans to understand what your setup is. So he's a hybrid almost of these kinds of things. And it's an interesting project, and it's in Alberta, like so much other magnificent resource endowment. So let's hear about what you're doing there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me. So maybe just to sort of transition from what Eric was saying, what you pointed out at the beginning, I think that the landscape is changing across the globe, but focus more on North America in terms of how we produce minerals, where the minerals are coming from, all of these things, how it was, and the pandemic is a good bullseye, like a pin to say that's where the pivot point happened. But as you pointed out, these things were happening before the pandemic. They all got highlighted. They came to the surface just because we had supply chain issues that were already a little bit tight, also exacerbated by lockdowns and people not working, and therefore nothing getting produced and so on. So this deglobalization and this shift is happening, and there's some really good positives that are going to come out of this. Those are that we're going to bring manufacturing, and the U.S. is leading the charge on this with the CHIP Act and the RA and the Defense Production Act, all of these things geared here in the United States, for the large part, to bring in supply, manufacturing locally to North America, but specifically in this case to the United States. There's going to be some short-term pain. I think inflation is going to be a short-term pain. If we want to manufacture it ourselves in North America, it's going to cost more. The benefit on the other end is we're all going to have jobs because we're producing all of these materials, all of these products locally. And so we're going to have a vibrant economy to go into the future with. And I think that's a very positive thing. And I think that we should look at it as a very positive thing, even though there might be some short-term inflationary losses there. And so when you look at from the Alberta lens, and the project is in Alberta, Canada. Alberta is known as a oil producing province. It's the Texas of Canada, if I will. And we have huge oil reserves. A lot of them are mined with trucks and shovels. And that causes a lot of sort of social strife in terms of that, the efficacy and the environmental conscience of that production of that oil specifically. And it has limited its ability to be sold globally at times. And it's a frustration largely in the province. But we have the world's third largest oil reserves. So on the other side, when you look at it from an energy security perspective, which is a big topic right now, Canada has extreme energy security because of those oil reserves that we have in Alberta. And that enables us to, when you look at it from the perspective, I mean, the Russia-Ukraine conflict right now is highlighting how important energy security is. And so this theme is pushing us all to the same sort of inflection point, and that is that security is the problem. Security is what everyone's looking at, and security of everything now, energy, minerals, the whole thing, jobs, economy, everything is focused around that security, and everything that, not everything, but a lot of what we're talking about globally in the Western global side of things is about that security, and certainly a very hot topic here in the United States, and therefore also in Canada, because we are generally, as we were talking about this morning, in lockstep on a lot of these issues, Canada to the United States. So just a little bit about what we're doing in Alberta. We have a lithium asset. It was an oil aquifer, so it's conventional, it's not mining. And we actually joke, I'll give this to Lee, we say brines, not mines. We're producing a fluid from a well, just like you produce conventional oil. This aquifer was discovered by ExxonMobil Imperial Oil back in the 1940s, producing where we're producing since the 60s, but it's out of oil. It was only about a couple of % oil at the beginning. Now it's mostly lithium-enriched brine. The company has been developing a technology to enable this, and we're not the only ones developing this type of technology called direct extraction that enables you to be able to take the lithium out of the brine. But the implications of this getting into commercial operations is that we talk about security of some of these critical minerals. North American production of lithium is limited to 4,000 tons a year. The world needs 3 million tons, and we only produce 4,000 in North America. So we have to go from pretty much 0 to 100% overnight. And that's what, when you talk about, like we're here on the industry panel, the government panel is going to be next. That's the challenge that industry faces. The government is asking us to do this. The partnerships that happen, and we'll talk about mineral tenure, but it does fall on industry shoulders to develop these assets. Governments in this world, in North America, don't generally go out and do the development themselves. They incentivize, they partner, but they don't do the work. Industry is left to do the work. So in Alberta, we have an opportunity to produce, and across Alberta, probably at least a quarter of North America's lithium demand by the time it ramps up to full production, which is not day one. It takes a long time, as you've stated. We'll have been doing this 10 years by the time we get our first production running. That's only going to be about 20,000 tons of the demand of about 1 million tons, maybe a bit less than 1 million tons in North America by the 2030 to 2035. So still only a small portion of it, but Alberta can produce probably 500,000 over time. But that has to keep lockstep as well with the way that the industry is growing. And, you know, we talk about electrification. And electrification is the battery itself forms a pivotal sort of cornerstone. It's like it's a stepping stone, I think, more than anything in electrification, because you need to be able to transport those electrons efficiently and cheaply to make electrification happen. It's not the be-all, end-all. The battery is not the solution. It's not an energy source. We will still use hydrocarbons as that energy source for a very long time. And that means that when you talk about the EV being green, it's not. It depends on the carbon footprint of the materials you produce, and it depends on the carbon footprint of the power going into it. So places in Canada like Quebec and BC have a near zero carbon grid, so the emissions to drive the vehicle are near zero. But the production emissions are still quite high. But the landscape in mining is also changing. As you electrify or hydrogenify, you know, the heavy haul transport, you can therefore also bring electrification into hauling trucks and shovels and mining to bring the carbon footprint down. E3 and the lithium in Alberta, it's all electric. We use pumps to pump the water around. That's electric driven. We use we plan to use an electric process to make the hydroxide, which is the battery product. So, you know, there's a two-step process. You make a precursor product. This is industry across the whole lithium industry. We're no different. We do it slightly differently, but the fundamentals are still the same. We produce a lithium sulfate, and that gets converted into lithium hydroxide. Generally in the world, that happens in two places. A lot of that hydroxide production actually is in China, which is going to cause a lot of problems in 2025 when the Inflation Reduction Act prohibits that from coming into these batteries. So we need to bring that North American supply on. The sources of the lithium molecules are coming from everywhere, Australia, South America, not from North America. But North America has the opportunity to bring conversion at the source. So that's what E3 plan is. So we're going to make the hydroxide locally in Alberta that we can sell directly to the battery manufacturers without having to go offshore to be secondary refined. And that's also an electric-based process. So 98% of our power, our energy consumption is electricity. If that has a low carbon to no carbon footprint, then the product that's going to come out of our process is going to have a low to no carbon footprint, which means when you look at it from the carbon footprint of the car, those sources of these products are decarbonizing. And it's going to take a long time to decarbonize them, but they are decarbonizing. We were talking to actually a counterpart at Euro company in Europe, and they're talking that, you know, on the North American average grid, if you account for the carbon footprint of the manufacturer of the EV, it takes 140,000 kilometers to get carbon neutral on that car. But that is drastically changing, because what's happening is that if you have an electric car, you can therefore enable low carbon sources of power, and you can bring that down. You can't do that with an internal combustion engine. So the path to net zero is an electric future, is an electric car, but it doesn't immediately enable it. It's on the path towards it. And so the path towards the goals to 2050, they only happen with electrified transport or hydrogen transport for the heavy hauling, which I believe is probably a good place for hydrogen is heavy transport. So I think bringing that all to head, you know, what the world is seeing right now is a mini industrial revolution. I really think that's what we're seeing when it comes to electrification. And you're right, we're gonna have to make bigger power sources. We're gonna have to, you know,
Nuclear.
we're gonna have to. I mean, we don't really have a choice. If we want to go carbon neutral, we're gonna have to look at these other sources. Europe is feeling this right now. We were in Germany last week, and it's a big topic about, you know, should the government have shut down all those nuclear plants? And the general population, at least that we talked to, have said no. And so, you know, transmission lines, all of these things, but this is why it's a bit of an industrial revolution, because we're going to have to grow all of this from, and not from zero. You know, there's a lot of electricity out there in the world, but we're going to have more if we're going to power it. We're going to have to put charging stations. We're going to have to do all that stuff. So, I didn't really answer your question about tenure in Alberta, and I can go into that if you want, but.
No, I think, Chris, what I'm interested in, if you could explain, because what I find fascinating is that the United States remains the world's biggest producer of oil. And Alberta alone is the fourth biggest producer of oil in the world.
Yeah.
and you have a reservoir with this added benefit, there must be these lithium reserves scattered throughout the sedimentary basin in the United States and the rest of Canada as well. This is like the new wonder thing. Are people exploring for that? I've got to believe the Exxons who discovered this one are looking at everything they have in inventory to see. Is that a potential savior here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's all sources of lithium that are being developed right now, whether it's a hard rock mine or a salar in the hotter climates or these direct extraction. I think we're going to need all of them, especially in the next 10 years. But I think it does bring on a supply that isn't there in the world today. It revolves around this direct extraction technology, which is just ion exchange. So it's water treatment. It's a giant water treatment facility. Ion exchange is used to take metals out of water. We use it in uranium treatment. We use it in water treatment for municipal water softener. Taking calcium out of water is the same technology. So we've developed, and our peers that are doing this as well have developed this to take lithium out of these brines very selectively. There are others doing it. There are resources in
But
Arkansas.
just qualify,
Yeah.
you're saying your project is capable of meeting 1/4 of the demand for lithium in the
Alberta's
whole
a
of
province.
the whole of North America.
Yeah.
We just need 3 more of
Yeah.
these mines.
Well,
They've
and-
got to be in North America somewhere,
There
or
are
Brazil or wherever.
Yeah, I mean there are brines in Arkansas. There are brines in California.
Okay.
Those are the 2 big sources in the United States. They are both using these similar types of technology to get the lithium out of them. But like anything else, like it still needs to work. It still needs to be built. It costs money. All of that stuff still needs to happen, and that's where, the capital markets, the government funding, that's becomes the challenge at that point. Is they're out there, the sources are there, the technology is becoming more mature, so that risk is becoming much less, but capital needs to be deployed.
Great. Good stuff, eh? Time for you guys to ask questions. Lawrence?
Thank you, Diane. That was a very interesting discussion. I'm Larry Herman from Toronto. I'm a colleague on the executive with Diane. When we talk about critical minerals and electrification, it's all dependent upon microprocessing. Microprocessing technology is what we use to put into effect the lithium for purposes of electrification. And Chris, you mentioned something, and I wanted to have both of you address this. Last month, the United States, through executive action, put into effect a microprocessing rule. And that rule prevents, essentially, any development at the high end of microprocessing technology to be used in any transaction with China. And it has global implications because it covers not only microprocessing goods and technology in the United States, but anywhere in the world that has in any way involvement of U.S. microchips or technology. So when we talk about critical minerals, I think we can't forget the impact of this new microprocessing rule and its global effect. And it has an impact on Canada-U.S. relations in terms of critical mineral development. So I'd like to have some comments on what you two think this new rule will have in global terms.
I think, like, the day that happened, and I'm regurgitating this secondhand, you started to see people move out immediately, the intellectual property moving out. And I think it's a good case study. It's a good case study to see what's going to happen as we bring this manufacturing, because it's going to have to go somewhere. If it's not manufactured on Chinese soil, and it has to go to somewhere, is that back onto North American soil? Is that on another friendly nation where maybe manufacturing is still a bit cheaper? Those questions and how this sort of rejigs itself in terms of world politics is going to be a good case study. All of those chips are required for an electric future, just like the battery is. So they're as critical to the electric future as a battery. They're actually used in to make a lithium battery safe, you have a battery management system, which is a little computer that tells the battery how to charge and discharge, and those are critical to the safety aspect. So, yeah, I think that the impact's going to be felt for sure. But that is more immediate, and that's why I think it's a good case study, because we're trying to push the government actions. I shouldn't say we, but the government actions are trying to push critical minerals to that stage. But I think that this is instantaneous. Like it's going to happen very quickly, and so we can use it maybe as a guide to how markets and normalizing things will happen, and then we can sort of see how it naturalizes as it happens.
Eric, do you have a comment?
Yes, I guess I would maybe parse that observation / question a couple of ways. One is whenever you have rules and regulations that require something to be built or made somewhere, local contenting laws or that, it's a response, to the economic impact or security. The chip crisis, if you will, resulted in, tens of thousands of vehicles parked in fields and empty lots all over manufacturing facilities throughout the United States and in Europe and everywhere. And people realize, to your point, how fragile that was. I think critical materials, that's a value-added component of chip. They take silicon, they design it, to your point, ton of IP in it. When you look at resources like cobalt and platinum and copper and lithium, and you start creating a strategy where you have access to those, whether they're in your country or they're not, I think there are some lessons learned in that because we are going to be going toe-to-toe with some of our international acquaintances, China being one of them. In this very room yesterday, there was a map of South America. Karina was her name, I can't remember her last name, but she showed that when you source to China, they get the raw materials, a lot of them, from South America, okay? In 2000, most of that relationship was directly with North America. Now most of it's directly with China. Diane pointed out at the beginning that they've been creating those relationships for literally the last couple of decades. And to your point, Larry, I think if we're not late to the game, we're pretty close to it. I'm not sure what the answer is. What do I think about it? I think what we did before is we assumed it was going to work out. But I think what we see now that we know that low carbon, no carbon solutions are going to require electrification, they're going to require a fundamental shift in resources, we have to be a lot more strategic with these relationships and careful about how we pick fights. Because you can't, somebody once was, spouting off that it's easy to win a trade war. Well, if you have something to trade, maybe you can compete. But, according to what Steve pointed out at the beginning, there's 15 things on that list that we don't have a source for currently. Diane, I just want to loop back to a point you made. You said, based on Chris's description, is there more lithium sources that we haven't identified? I believe, as part of my original education, that we don't look for things till you need to look for them, right?
That's a geologist talking.
Well, it's
Right.
the truth, right? I mean, oil used to be, a nuisance or an exotic thing.
Right.
And we didn't know that it was under the ocean. We didn't know that it was in some place other than Pennsylvania. People forget that Pennsylvania was the oil capital of the United States, not Texas, But we started looking for it. And so, Larry, to your point there, I think it's just going to force us to put on the high beams and start looking at the future. Because I think a lot of us have a feeling in here that we've been trying to drive forward by looking through the rearview mirror. That only works when the road's straight, and it's anything but straight right now.
Hey, question.
So I'd just like Chris to sort of comment on the issue that the Canada Revenue Agency has ruled effectively that brine and anything that's an embedded resource does not qualify for Canadian exploration expense, which is a critical part of the financing of these mines, because if you can't get CDE, you can't go through shares, which means you can't finance
Oh, Lord.
exploration in Canada
Yep.
because you can't do it cheaply, okay? So I would just like to get a comment on, so that's an issue that brine does not qualify for CDE or CDE, which is Canadian Development Expense either, technically. About that technical impediment, so I'd like some comments on that, but also from you, from the panel here, about other areas where they see, like, we wanna do this is great, we wanna move forward, but there's a rule that says, no, we don't qualify. There's a rule that says, actually, we're gonna benefit this other thing rather than what you're doing. Can you identify other sort of like key stumbling blocks that are government sort of generated that you can see in your path? Because it's not just about exploring, it's about turning it into the, like you said, moving it from brine into hydroxide, and then that whole process, like, are there other stops along the way that need to be?
One cheeky comment I'll make is if you're not in Alberta, you've got a problem. Alberta is the best place to find anything.
Yeah,
But that
Yeah.
being said,
that being
Yeah.
said,
Yes.
But not only, like, I'm highlighting a very technical issue that I want everybody to know about, so I'll do something about it. But-
Yeah, you,
But I also, are there other technical issues that you see where it's like, this needs to be changed and needs to be changed now?
on the CE, the next panel, Jeff is going to be a good person to talk to about that. We identified this problem in 2018 and have been working closely to change the definition and the reliance on bedded and non-bedded in the CRA's reliance on Natural Resources Canada for that definition, which is where the heart of this is coming from. And I can't comment on how that progression is coming, but it certainly has been identified very clearly to the government that that is a problem, and that if the traditional way of viewing mines is that non-bedded is a mine and bedded is an oil and gas, so if it's bedded, it's obviously not a mineral. I think that's changing, but you can ask Jeff. They're on the forefront of that, and he's actually a good resource, so you have him here to talk to. On the other side of other government impediments, I think, Dan is right. Alberta is probably the best province in Canada to be developing. And, and you look at the North American landscape, because we're here to talk about Canada and U.S. Senator Manchin, who I got to meet this summer, got the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and then at the last minute, the permitting reform they had, and I can't remember the act that I got pulled out of, but in a second act got pulled out. And there's a lot of cry that says that without permanent reform, the Inflation Reduction Act is less meaningful, because you need to be, the not in my backyard is a huge problem. Alberta doesn't have that problem. And so from the perspective of where I sit in developing the project that I'm looking at, Alberta wants it in their backyard. And because this was an historic oil and gas aquifer that has had wells pumping fluids, and this lithium brine, like we're talking about these minerals, we didn't know about. I mean, we knew lithium is in this brine since the 60s, but nobody cared about it. And now we've developed a technology because people care and there's value, right? The value of lithium was so low you never would have approached this aquifer to produce from, and now the value is there enabling this, and the technology don't require it. So it's sort of a non-answer, unfortunately. The governments, they're there to, in Canada, I think the viewpoint is that they're there to support industry, but they're still a government, and they still have a government mindset to the way they operate. So, threading that needle is important for industry. But I would say that we've been, especially critical minerals, I've never seen it like this, that the government is so supportive of an industry. And I've been in mining for 20 years, and never has the availability of capital and support from the government been this strong for development of critical minerals in Canada. So I think that there's a lot of support.
one more question?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if this is off topic, so you could make someone else if it is. My name's Anita Barlow. I was founding team lead for the COLA program here that Mike has built wonderfully, and has finished, we're both co-edited on climate and security. So I've been looking at this issue from the offshore, and there seems to be a growing interest in looking offshore, both in domestic waters and international, for critical minerals. I wonder, one, if that falls into your purview as you're thinking about this, and second, in the context of shifting from a low carbon context, what are the environmental concerns, interests, regulations, self-regulation that occurs or is occurring or should be occurring in the context if it's on land and offshore? U.S. isn't even a member of UNCLOS, so in terms of international water. So what kind of standards are emerging, whether it's onshore or offshore?
That's a lot of questions. Let's just, thank you. No, you've made great points. If you would just quickly, each of you comment on offshore exploration and development around North America and anywhere else in the world, quickly, about critical minerals mining, offshore mining.
I don't have much of a comment. I'm not an expert in if you're talking offshore, like in ocean offshore, not, yeah.
I haven't heard of it.
I know a lot about the geological implications of it, but I'm not an expert in policy.
Shift back to land, if you will, in terms of, thank you, in terms of environment, regulatory, that process as it ongoes. Alberta certainly is aware of that.
Yeah, from the lens that I have, developing these projects, it's always consumer driven, right? When people like target oil and gas companies because they don't want people to burn hydrocarbons, that's not the source of the problem. The source is that we have to use them, and that's what we have at our disposal. And so the same is with the consumer. And what the consumer is saying, and this is your background, is that we want low carbon, tight ESG materials. The problem right now is that the supply is so short that they're probably going to just take whatever they can get. But as the market matures in the next 10 to 15 years and it normalizes and supply demand starts to balance, or we're not, the prices come off a little bit and everything's a bit more in equilibrium, and you have choice, the choice is going to lead you to the low carbon sources. So for companies like us, day one, we might not have as low carbon of a product as we might in year 3. And that's just because strategically, capital it will add capital. And that's the other thing. You're going to have to pay more to get a low carbon for most things in this world. If you want it low carbon, you have to pay a bit more. And so at the very beginning, that means that we have to deploy more capital. That's why we have to charge more. We have higher operating costs. That's why we would charge more. At the very beginning, we will likely not worry about that and just produce it from grid power. Like I mentioned, most of our energy is electricity. But we can bring in low carbon source of power in Alberta. There's lots of technology out there that enable it to do this that are available on the market today. But that might add capital that we're not willing to do day one. But definitely we'll have to have it in place and have to design the facility to be able to add that, because it will become a very important metric in terms of our carbon footprint of our product in the future.
Okay, well, that wraps it up. Something for you to consider too in terms of your interest in environmental. There's some quite amazing engineering work being done in Alberta on putting carbon sequestration. But, filling these old, it's really quite interesting. It's not necessarily going to save the world overnight, but there's tons of money going into that. So we're done. It's a wrap. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next panel is our Government and Public Policy panel. And I will introduce the moderator of our panel, and then turn it over to him, and we can dig in. So, walking up is our very own executive committee member, Peter MacKay. And everybody who's Canadian knows Peter MacKay, all right? He's a very famous member of Parliament. He served in very dignified offices there, including the former Attorney General of Canada and the Minister of Defense of Canada. And he comes from the northeastern side of the country, Nova Scotia. So, Peter, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the panelists and take it from there.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and welcome. Good morning. I have flown in from the East Coast. where climate change is certainly wreaking havoc. We had hurricane conditions there a few weeks ago, and I must say it's quite interesting to be traveling again as well. The last time I was in this room, I made an off-color remark about a hockey analogy concerning the Conservative Party of Canada. I'm tempted to say something similar this time about missing an open net, but I will restrain myself as I want to leave here unscathed. We, on a serious note, we have some terrific experts with us for this particular discussion. Jeff Labonte is the Assistant Deputy Minister for Natural Resources Canada, Lands and Mining Sector. He's coming to us from the capital in Ottawa to your capital in Washington. And Samir Fazili, I hope I'm pronouncing Fazili, is the Deputy Director of the United States President's National Economic Council, and her portfolios include supply chain and critical minerals. So we couldn't have two more insightful leaders in the field to discuss this important issue of critical minerals and the strategic challenges and opportunities that present for both our countries. Collaboration seems to be the obvious place to start, perhaps. And so, Samir, perhaps we could start with you in terms of your view of how Canada and the United States are grappling with what is an enormous challenge, but on the other hand, given all of these factors around climate change, what's happening with conflict in the world today, and the rush that we all feel, the urgency to address some of the difficulties with coping with greenhouse gas emissions, and how some countries are taking this seriously. Certainly we are in North America, other countries not so much, but critical minerals factor enormously into the global response and our North American response. So collaboration between government as an element of this.
Yeah. To answer that, let me start by, orienting our audience to kind of the steps and actions that we are taking here in the U.S., because that lays the framework for, I think, why we are so excited about the opportunities for collaboration between the two countries. I think the prior panel talked a lot about the challenges, and so we're all wide-eyed about the challenges. Our President Biden, has laid out a really ambitious agenda to decarbonize the U.S. economy, and that included a goal of 50% of new vehicles sold by 2030 being electric. And in these first 20 months in office, we've actually had some pretty landmark successes on the legislative side, and also put in place an economic and industrial strategy that has really awakened private capital and mobilized private investments in clean energy technologies, not just electric vehicles and battery manufacturing, but the full supply chain, with over $100 billion invested there. And you've seen consumer adoption of these electric vehicles triple since taking office. But we know that we're not the only country making this transition to a clean energy future. And so just a few numbers for us to just have in our head. We know that the demand for critical minerals is set to skyrocket. By some estimates, it's 4,000% by 2040 for minerals like lithium and graphite. You see wildly varying estimates about the supply-demand gap and the price impacts that's going to have, but recent BCG study says the price has increased tenfold in the past 2 years on the lithium side, and says at least we have enough supply to meet demand, but by 2030 they start to project some modest shortfalls of around 4%, and by 2035 see gaps accelerating to the 25% range. And this is in a context, and the prior panel kind of talked about this, where the exploration and the technology is still catching up, but by today's kind of technologies, we have about 6% of world reserves between our two countries. But a lot of innovation going into scale, geothermal brines, remining, other opportunities to extract the resource. So we know that demand is moving fast. There's a lot of uncertainty about the kind of battery chemistries that are going to dominate in the future, and that's going to really affect the volume of the minerals. And so there's a lot of uncertainty around private investment, which is why we've taken so much effort to provide a set of incentives and drive some regulatory and legal certainty to the market to mobilize capital. One thing we did early on was lay out a strategy, a kind of industrial strategy around critical minerals early on that would lay out a framework for how we were going to advance our nation's energy security as we transition towards a clean energy future. The goal that we laid out there was to secure an end-to-end supply chain for critical minerals that would reduce our dependence on unreliable supply chains, ensure our national security, and reflect our values for high labor and environmental standards, while also promoting indigenous rights and tribal and community consultations. The tactics that we would put in place, we had three core kind of elements to the strategy, recognizing that you're going to have to take a mineral by mineral approach as you do this. The conditions, the geology, the science around each mineral is very different, and the industry capabilities are very different. So the three kind of core elements to our approach are expanding sustainable and responsible domestic production. Second, reforming our domestic rules and regulations to strengthen standards and increase efficiency, something we talked a fair amount about in the prior panel. And then third is working with allies and partners to develop more secure, diverse, and sustainable supply chains. We've taken a number of actions to implement this strategy, and that includes securing funding under the Defense Production Act for critical minerals production, processing, and recycling. We've established a mining reform working group led by our Department of Interior that has done a lot of consultation right now to get input from all stakeholders about what direction they want to see all those reforms head. And then on the global side, launching multilateral partnerships like the Partnership on Global Infrastructure and Investment with the G7. Last month, the president announced a new initiative that would bring all of this work together called the American Battery Materials Initiative that's going to help us align the federal resources, enhance all this collaboration, and support faster and fairer permitting. And that brings me to like the collaboration with Canada, because the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act has us really poised to move at greater speed and scale in executing on this mineral and battery strategy, this industrial strategy. Canada, as everyone in this room knows, is our largest trading partner. We have highly integrated supply chains, and so we are well poised to build off of that history of collaboration and expand it further in the critical mineral space and up the value chain, up the full value chain. There are three particular areas where I think we're particularly well poised for near-term, kind of immediate action on joint cooperation. The first is production and processing of critical minerals. I mentioned the DPA investments that we have. I saw that then after I got scheduled, my colleague Matt Zolonowski from the Department of Defense is your lunch speaker, so you'll probably hear more on this from him. But we have such tight collaboration between our two countries on the defense industry, and that includes an integrated defense supply chain. And Canada is designated as part of the U.S. industrial base, so we know that our Department of Defense has the ability to make its DPA investments in Canada and in companies domiciled in Canada. Second, fostering the development of high road markets. We have already committed to work together to identify projects with high ESG standards for joint funding to reduce the level of investment risk and to increase private investment flows to projects with high ESG standards. The clean energy incentives that we just passed in the Inflation Reduction Act, the whole bevy of tax incentives, they provide bonus credits for projects that create good paying jobs and offer quality training. We're also seeing our private companies mobilize around creating industry standards. So, the U.S. automakers like Ford, GM, and Tesla have joined private standard-setting bodies like the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. I know the major European automakers have also joined that. And then the third area where we see a lot of opportunity and already doing a lot of collaboration is on supply chain security. the Inflation Reduction Act again offers a consumer tax credit for purchasing of new electric vehicles. Claiming the full credit requires North American and free trade partner content, and that applies to batteries and to minerals themselves. In addition, there's a new kind of provision in there around foreign entities of concern, and if the supply chain contains content from foreign entities of concern, you don't qualify for the credit. Those provisions won't take effect until 24 or 20 and 25, just depending on how they're written. But we know that both our countries have been strengthening our kind of investment screening regime and taking other steps to make sure that we are looking at ways to support the development of more diverse global supply chains, not just, and because I think we talked about this in the prior panel as well, the pandemic made us realize that high dependency on supply chains that have too much geographic concentration risk, it doesn't serve anyone's interests, and the private sector or consumers or workers or governments themselves. And so we're all looking at the new set of tools we can all mobilize together between the government and the private sector to help create a new set of global value chains that aren't only focused on short-term efficiency, but are kind of more optimized towards longer-term resiliency, especially as climate change will really increase the level of risk and interruption that supply chains might face. So I guess I'll pause there.
Sure. Well, Samira, you've covered a great deal of subject matter, and I want to give Jeff an opportunity to provide a Canadian perspective. But if I might, Jeff, just in your response, if you could touch a little bit on how, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that you're coming at this from a public service perspective, but politics, of course, is omnipresent, and we're here to be forthright and factual, and I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot, but it breaks down, you would have to admit at times, when government policies don't actually align. And you referenced electric vehicles, and there was a time, it seems to be on better footing now, where it looked like Canada and the U.S. were a bit wrong-footed in terms of how we were going to deal with the policy of electric vehicles by a certain set date. So I'll turn it to you, Jeff. I know we've laid a good foundation here through Samira's references, but from a Canadian perspective.
Great. Well, listen, thank you very much for the chance to join the conversation, and could probably repeat a fair bit of the context of the previous panel, but maybe just to bring some perspectives that will come to the same place, but from a different starting point. I think the first issue that's the most interesting of this is the critical minerals construct, and what's happening with it is really a nexus of some very interesting human and government issues and issues as society we're dealing with. I mean, on a one scale, it's about economic development and changing and about growing a different set of requirements and things that are driving economic development and change around the world. And that's something that's happened quickly, and it's happening at a much more accelerated pace. And so there's volatility, there's change, there's demand curves. Samira's mentioned some of those as examples that have economies and industry trying to figure out and trying to kind of invest in the right places, but managing risk associated with those investments. At the same time, there's a national security dimension that finds itself at the nexus of how economies operate and how economic security is part of national security. And we look at economic security in some contexts and geographic concentration and supply restrictions and demands that are happening around the world. Exercising of market forces and exercising of authority within markets and within different economies is not necessarily always following exactly the paths we would expect. And so that is another point of concern from a public policy perspective that brings government and industry in the same place, but also trying to make sure that the signaling is happening. Private investment is moving in the direction it needs to be, but government is trying to step in where it needs to and trying to signal to markets to bring stability. Because some of these transitions and the scale of the investment is such of significant proportion, there's a lot to be won and lost, and depending on how that turns. And then the latter point is about the transition and the change around energy sources and energy storage, energy management, energy distribution, and the use of energy in our economies, in our lives, in the way that we work, the way that we play, the way that we enjoy the quality of life that we have as a society. So when you put all those things together, it brings a lot of really interesting public policy dimensions together. And so speaking about this, I think it's implicit that we're talking about industrial policy, and we're talking about industrial policy of a large scale that, as Western democracies, we haven't seen in a very, very long time. References to usually world war events, events of catastrophic change happening in society are parallels that are brought about that we're experiencing now. So when we look at, for example, the mining sector, and if I kind of zoom in on Canada for a minute, as the previous panel mentioned, Canada is a resource-driven commodity economy that has substantial resources and assets and has been well developed at bringing those resources to market for many different economic returns and raising the social living and prosperity of Canada and its different regions and provinces. Our Constitution has most of those resources belonging to the provincial jurisdictions, which means the scale and pace at which the development occurs in the legal framework is one that's more localized within a national construct. So that is actually an interesting dimension that allows for both variation, but also brings, if you will, practices that can be modeled across the country as one jurisdiction learns from another, and as we kind of optimize. So when we look at that, Canada is a large supplier. So unlike the situation here in the United States, we're not a net importer of many of the minerals that are on our critical minerals list. And many of our critical minerals that we have are not actually developed because we don't actually have a demand for them in our domestic economy. So we have this resource potential and we have this opportunity. We also have a huge capacity. So Canada's mining community has some 60 different minerals that we produce. We have some 200 different operating mines and some 10,000 estimated potential projects in the liking from the exploration stages into the construct of being able to potentially produce mines. So we have a skill set in this area where we have capital markets, we have engineering expertise, we have companies that operate around the country and around the world. So it's an area where Canada has a strong capacity and a strong ability to bring more to bear. So we have a opportunity to supply more into the global market. So our critical mineral strategy starts with looking at increasing supply, not dissimilar from the US example of increasing supply for domestic purposes, and to think about supporting domestic value added and industry development and manufacturing. All of those are shifting as we talk. So we talk about nearshoring, friendshoring, reshoring, about bringing different supply chains back to North America, back to our respective countries. That's a transition as well that requires investment and structuring and change, and one in which what are the features that governments are putting in place to try and drive that. So that second part from our strategy is to try and grow not just the sale and development of the commodity, but actually the processing and ability for that commodity to be used for economic returns domestically and in a North American context. Our strategy also then focuses on collaborating through multilateral fora and bilaterally with our allies. So we share the same interest and have been collaborating with the United States on critical minerals for almost 4 years. We have an action plan, we have work underway, and a number of things, and I can speak to that at quite a bit of detail as our panel might provide for. But I also would underline the other component where we work domestically, but also think globally. And so it's helpful to think about our domestic policy driving our international policy and our relationship with countries, particularly the United States being our largest partner, but also in times of rapid change around the world and pressure around the world, our economies and our countries generally run together, and we usually run closer together rather than further apart. So as we look at some of the things that are underway now, it's natural that we would expect to partner more and that collaboration to escalate. And talking through that collaboration, we share things like indigenous populations, about development in indigenous and regional areas. The not in my backyard issue is one in which the local impact to some of the development activities around mining and processing and industrial activities tend to have local impacts. And those local impacts are felt most directly in the construct of where they occur, but yet they occur across our different geographies quite differently. And so we need to think through that. So from our perspective, another component of our strategy, which is mirrored in the United States strategy, is ensuring that the environmental, social, and governance standards, which we as modern economies and and democratic countries aspire to, not only domestically within our own jurisdictions and within each province, but also that we would expect that our companies and that our economies expect the same of where we source things globally. And so how do we ensure that in moving to meet that demand and finding that supply that's needed to transition, as the way we've spoke to for critical minerals, that we are not necessarily winning by losing, meaning we might supply some of those resources and discover them and move them from other countries to our own countries, but in a way in which the environment has to be cared for, development has to be responsible, benefits have to flow to local governments and local communities that are impacted by development, so that we see that messaging kind of find its way. And it's another differentiator that helps us on an economic side, where sustainability and the ability to produce goods at low carbon, in a low carbon fashion, can produce the outcomes that we want, that consumers in North America are more and more demanding, and in Europe and other like-minded economies. So these are features that we share with the United States, but features that also drive our domestic policy framework as well. And certainly, I'll probably pause here, but the alignment, the misalignment between features of incentives and policy agendas is going to happen when you have two independent countries acting independently in their domestic construct. But the collaboration usually kind of ends up having us find ways in which those things align together. So the Defense Act example of Canada being a destination for U.S. defense procurement because of our integrated defense economy. The same occurs in our investment frameworks around security. The same occurs around just the flow of goods across the border. And we see it also in the one last point, which I think will come up further in our conversation, just around energy security, and the future of energy security will require mineral security. And so when we think about energy security in North America, the energy flows between our two countries are so integrated and so stable in terms of whether it's oil or gas or electricity or renewables. The same we would expect and aspire to be true of mineral security as we lean into the future. And our two economies rely on minerals as a stronger and bigger part of the energy security for North America.
I think that's a really good sort of transition point in terms of the national security element of this, because you're absolutely right. The energy security, just as in previous debates and the renewal of the former NAFTA agreement brought into play some of that discussion as well. But and you've both referenced the volatility that we're experiencing, perhaps unprecedented in our lifetime, in terms of the threat that seems to appear from abroad. China is going to be part of this conversation, to be sure, as they are in so many different ways. But the need for a critical mineral or critical mineral strategy where Canada is able to support this security relationship, as well as the economic relationship, is inevitably going to bring into the discussion how we're going to be able to supply the bulk of resources necessary for the auto sector, but for this green transition that both countries are going through. So it comes down to a question of cost, because these, like we've seen in the energy sector, the mining sector is an enormously capital extensive investment for both the private sector and government increasingly is trying to sort of stay hands-off. So where does that guarantee or that base of defense infrastructure come from if there is this capital-intensive nature for these mega projects that the Defense Production Act in the United States could be part of the vehicle for this in terms of investment, perhaps not exclusively, but an anchor investor? Not sure. I haven't heard much discussion in Canada about the openness to have that type of investment coming in. Certainly there are a lot of warning shots that are coming now from other external foreign investment, mainly China. But this idea that the National Defense Procurement Act can underwrite some of these big projects for critical minerals. Just interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, I think you've referenced a couple things. I mean, I think when we look at the national security posture, there has been some changes domestically in Canada recently about foreign investment. Right. And that's simply to say that the critical mineral sector is being treated under increased scrutiny. That scrutiny is really looking at where foreign investment is coming from and we're expecting that foreign investment will not move in the direction of state-owned enterprises and other things going forward. And that statement has been made, and there's lawyers in the room who will be able to quote it exactly in terms of how it fits in the Investment Canada Act, and happy to talk about that offline.
And I think, sorry to interrupt you, but Minister Champagne has quite recently issued a bit of an edict that took 3 state-owned enterprises out of circulation in Canada.
That's correct. So we have, if I will, intensified the security dimension of foreign investment and control over the resources. But your question was about the Defense Procurement Act and seeing whether that was, so one of the issues with not naturally moving in the direction that we've moved in is that there are some of the capital that would have potentially come from state-owned enterprises is not going to be moved into the market. But some of the potential increased investment could come from things like the United States Defense Procurement Act and other allies who are looking to invest in partnerships and sustainability and looking at the longer term. So one of the volatility impacts is the impact of things are changing quickly. Mines tend to take a lot of investment, and they tend to take long periods of time to develop before they reach production, but they tend to have long runs that follow. So it's a perfect scenario for people who want to build supply chain security and stability, because there's a long run and there's a long opportunity that can extend over time that brings that stability. The pressure point now is, of course, everybody wants the resources tomorrow, and there's a lag between when you can set up the actors and set up the investors and be able to kind of connect the dots. And that's where I think the volatility is over the next little while, and where government collaboration and government intervention is likely trying to smooth that so that the private sector can step in and play the role that it always has and just can enable that longer run. So for now, I think we are certainly in that space of welcoming, and we always will be, looking at the recognition of the time dimension that we have to manage in that capital.
Sure. Samira, that is a perfect bridge to this sense of urgency that I think everyone is feeling in this transition period. Certainly in energy, that it's inescapable. But I do want to come back to this question of how the United States will react if Canada, as the example here, but other countries as well, European Union countries, are not moving quick enough. And in the case of Canada, we've seen this in our energy sector, where, yes, there is still a flow, but much of it has been left in the ground and will be. There's a fear in some circles in Canada with respect to ESG, this becoming prohibitive for direct foreign investment or for development, period. And so I'm just trying to draw out how the United States will react to a lag time in a different jurisdiction when it comes to regulatory issues, when it comes to issues around consultation, issues that will not perhaps be seen as urgent or responsive to the needs of the United States.
Yeah. I think on our side, we recognize that having deep relationships means having deep respect for the processes and the politics in other jurisdictions, as we all kind of work collectively to help the world move to the net zero transition. We have always been able to build from a relationship that is based on honest dialogue and deep cooperation at the technical levels. And what is remarkable is that as government, as kind of like the senior leadership in the governments change over time, you have still seen the cooperation always deepen between our countries, or often has just kept deepening. And with the Inflation Reduction Act right now, I mean, we're in a posture where we're moving fast and we're moving aggressively, and are eager to see other countries come along, and will continue to find ways to encourage and to align, and also to see places where our incentives can help support the transitions that other countries are making. I mean, like one example, which isn't a Canadian example, is as we look at the production tax credits that we're establishing here in the U.S. for clean energy production, we know that that's going to bring like European offshore wind producers here into the U.S. So we think that there's opportunities for companies who are headquartered in Canada or working in Canada to be working across the border, and we don't think that there's like a strong risk of us moving not moving enough in lockstep, even if we're moving at different speeds in different places. I think both of our countries are hydrocarbon-rich countries too, and we are looking at all the ways that we are trying to responsibly manage our own energy transition as well, because we know there's going to be there is a transition period, and the war in Ukraine has made everyone aware that we have to take careful steps, but that working with allies and partners is actually a good way to manage the transition risk across countries, which is why our work with the Europeans to help strengthen their energy security, I think, is a great example of the way that collaboration and partnership is key to helping allies kind of mutually address these issues.
Beyond the discussion of the transition itself and the use of critical minerals to our collective strength, because Canada in particular, when it comes to these critical minerals, which can be identified, we were really born on third base. I mean, we didn't earn it by virtue of our geography. We have been blessed with both energy and critical minerals. But I want to lead to a bit of a discussion, and I know we're really pressed for time, but about the Arctic. And so the volatility, the geopolitical volatility that's weighing heavily on the minds of everyone, governments in particular, and the nature of these conflicts as they evolve, cyber attacks, saber rattling around nuclear, these are perhaps paralyzing in some capitals in terms of how they simultaneously deal with energy needs. There's going to be a real crunch occur in Europe, as we are hearing, because of the cutoff of the flow of natural gas from Russia. China is becoming more and more menacing in the South China Sea and potential naval blockades. So all of these are factors that can't be ignored, but there is a very specific vulnerability when we talk about security in North America, and that is the Arctic. Also tied into, of course, changes due to climate. But we have a very menacing neighbor just across those Arctic waters. You can't see it from there, but it's there. And that neighbor, not posing any immediate threat, but is also interested in resources, as is China. Now, the Arctic is a very pristine and special part of North America, again, shared responsibility in parts of the Arctic. And the Canada-US Law Institute did a specific panel discussion, several, on the Arctic. But I'm wondering how we reconcile as a country on this collaboration side, on the national security piece, the special, restrictive in some ways, policy and responses that are going to be required. Very difficult to operate there 8 months of the year, even though the waters are opening up, but untapped critical mineral deposits, undoubtedly. And the race to regulate and properly extract what we have north of 60 is going to be even more challenging. So just a little reflection from both of you on the specifics of critical minerals in the Arctic region.
Sure. Well, you've nailed the certain, I think, view that the Arctic is a special and unique part of North America, and Canada and the United States share Arctic shorelines. We share land boundaries in Arctic north of 60 areas, and we share indigenous populations that are the primary residents of those areas, and areas where there are rich natural resources, and the development of those resources has occurred in some instances, and it's a very challenging environment to work in. That's on land, and we share that part. Then there's the part about the coastline and the Arctic Ocean, how that fits the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea.
The internal Canadian waters you're referring to?
the
And the
internal-
Beaufort Sea.
and the Beaufort Sea, and the sort of the fact that the boundaries and the geography of the area is still an area in which a world-based rules system running through the United Nations Convention and trying to work through the Arctic nations, through the Arctic Council, is working to try and establish that the Arctic and how it's managed should be managed in a cohesive way. The game's certainly changed, with one of the neighbors perhaps having a much different perspective now, and that brings, I think, a much more increased attention around how do our security postures change to reflect that, both from a security point of view, but also presence on the landscape, the minerals and how they'll be developed. For the most part, the minerals on land are fairly well understood. I think the minerals that exist in the seabed are still subject to international conversations as to what happens outside of exclusive economic zones. So those are, I think, active areas that are not likely to change in terms of our interest in them and our ability to kind of manage them, although there are processes that are underway to help do those things. Those are long-term processes, just the way that they are. And I know you know that, but it's interesting because, we go through periods of time where I think things are less volatile, more stable. The Arctic has been an area where it has been very volatile in the past. We're exiting a period of stability, and we're entering back into a period where there is some increased volatility, and that will, I think, change the security posture in a number of different ways.
It's a really good point, Jeff. And the forums that allow for countries, Arctic nations, and the Arctic Council is suspended currently. You've both referenced the Aboriginal people of the North, who are really central to this discussion in terms of resource development. And so, Samira, just to give you an opportunity to comment on this as well, in terms of the U.S. perspective on the pace, I guess, and the tone, and how we continue in a productive way to manage resources and expectations about those resources.
Just building off what you said about the kind of indigenous communities who call that region home, as we set out to develop a framework for our mining reform and how we were going to approach that, we have said that it's important to recognize that in some instances you're going to want to protect special places and you're going to want to identify special places, and you may need to adopt a more restrictive posture in some of those places. I mean, our framework is really different from yours, just given that we don't have federal ownership of the minerals in most instances, but. And then the second piece of our work on thinking about how do you responsibly manage development in land that is owned or, in our context, it's tribal land or is a kind of has a special cultural significance to tribal communities, has been to identify places where you can pre-identify that those are kind of high conflict sites, what we refer to as high conflict sites, because in the consultations we've done with industry, they say that they don't have good resources available right now to make known where they might want to avoid doing exploration activities of various kinds. So we're looking at opportunities of what steps and actions can we take to help signal that and to help create that that kind of public record. And the other place we've identified as an area where we could, again, kind of bring more efficiencies into the market here is find some opportunities for pre-consultations and pre-notifications. Again, like our system, I know, is really different from yours, but on when it comes to mining and exploration activities on public lands, there isn't a requirement for the companies to currently have to notify others that they're starting some kind of pre-activities, and so they are often very far in the development of their kind of investment strategies and their plans before local communities or indigenous communities are even aware of what's happening, and so we're looking for opportunities to strengthen that. And then on the capital side, I've talked so much about the investment and the dollars that we're putting behind investing in private companies and de-risking things for companies, but we equally have resources available to support tribal consultation and capacity building so that they can identify and understand kind of the issues and risks inherent in a project, but also support tribal ownership of energy development projects. In the Inflation Reduction Act, the funding available through our Department of Energy, they have special tribal loan guarantee programs that will allow for energy development on tribal lands, as well as the tax credit provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act have been designed in such a way that tribal nations, tribal companies can claim those credits because there were some changes to the way the tax code in those areas. So.
Well, you're right to suggest that the consultation, the input from our First Nations is critical to all of this. And I think, again, not to dwell on the point of the Arctic, but we had a very practical example of their historic knowledge and operating capability when we were looking for the Franklin expedition and had spent considerable time and effort and money. And basically, someone in one of the remote Arctic communities said, "It's right over there." And sure enough, they were right. And I'm not at all trying to draw you into a political discussion on this subject, but foreign interference when it comes to what's happening in North America is something that our Chief of Defense Staff, so the equivalent of the Joint Chiefs, has raised recently. And he talked about Russia and China not just looking at regime survival, and I would add Iran to this as well, but regime expansion. And so we're in a very aggressive time and space. I referenced Francois-Philippe Champagne having made a very public pronouncement with respect to Chinese investment in certain natural resource companies in Canada. But this increasingly disruptive force is not only undeniable, but impossible to ignore. And this will play a tremendous role in the future on all of what we're discussing here in terms of development and transition and use of our resources, and critical minerals in particular. Mm-hmm. China plays a tremendous oversized role in this discussion, again, by virtue of the fact that they have many of these critical minerals and rare earth within their territorial boundaries. But they're being belligerent, to say the least. They're throwing their weight around, not just in their region, and becoming more and more disruptive on how the world plans to deal with climate change and accelerate this transition. So I guess just an open question, how, in your view, will our governments deal with this or replace China's hegemony on critical minerals? And one of the areas I think that we started this conversation with has to be around this collective effort of Western countries. I don't particularly like the friend-shoring. I find it's a little bit glib, but we do have to emphasize this collective effort of like-minded countries and values that creep into the discussion.
I can go first here. This is what has been remarkable is how much the pandemic and the war in Ukraine has, I think, really woke up the business community to these issues. I think the national security community for a long time was saying there's a lot of risk and geopolitical risk in these supply chains, and people didn't quite believe it until Russia invaded Ukraine. And what we've seen I mean, we had had data out there for years saying companies can expect to lose over 40% of 1 year's earnings every 10 years due to supply chain disruptions. But it took like the chips crisis, shaving 1% off U.S. GDP, driving a quarter of inflation last year for people to really realize what these impacts were going to be, and how the smallest component could lead to literally furloughing thousands of workers here in the U.S. What you've seen is a shift in company business practices. We're finally starting to see some promising early signs that they are diversifying their supply chains as a response. In 2020, you had when supply chain managers were being surveyed, about 55% of them said they source raw materials from 2 suppliers. Well, that's up to 80% now. What's really key here is that like-minded countries who are interested in a rules-based international order and market-based principles, not only that we harmonize our regime, but we also are working with the private sector and getting them to recognize that they can't only focus on short-term efficiency and lowest cost at all moments. Like lowest cost, short-term kind of mindset actually leads to higher costs for them and in the long run. And I think that through a variety of efforts, we had a supply chain ministerial this past summer with, I think, 18 of our largest trading partners, where we all made a joint commitment on supply chain security and resiliency. And we in the U.S. have also advanced the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has supply chains as a key pillar to advance really new models for working with our closest trading partners and allies on, in past eras, it was often a question of reducing kind of tariff barriers was like the animating factor that was driving stronger economic integration. Well, now the common problem most of us face is unsecure, unreliable supply chains. And so we're in an era of really promising new international cooperation in this era. So just like you don't like friendshoring, I hate the term deglobalization because I don't see that happening. I see more partnership, more engagement. What globalization was about was identifying common problems and achieving common solutions. And so we have a new common problem, and that common problem is this hyperconcentration in supply chains and climate change and the threat that is posing. And so it only makes sense for in this era those of us who are strong proponents of international integration and cooperation and trade, kind of the frameworks need to shift as to what we're trying to solve for.
So our advantage is, in fact, pulling together out of necessity, really, and our ability to do so, where other countries are loath to find friends that perhaps want to be on their side. From a Canadian perspective, do you see this as an opportunity for Canada perhaps to step up a little more where there is a necessity, as with energy, which I would argue that we've kind of missed the boat somewhat by not having the infrastructure in place. And that's my regional bias coming from the East Coast, where we had the Energy East pipeline that got tanked. But I think the opportunity now with critical minerals similarly presents Canada as a potential leader for the not just the transition, but some of the innovation, some of the ability to partner with countries that require those minerals, and that's also part of the reining in, or perhaps in some ways trying to curtail some of the aggressive behavior that we've seen on the geopolitical scene of late. So Canada's on the cusp of perhaps once again having a great opportunity fall in our lap if we're ready to act on it.
Well, it's a good point in terms of. So I guess I'd start by saying, as a nation, Canada has always been a trading-based nation. In fact, we've survived by trading, and our relationship with the United States is one that's thrived and prospered our economy, and it's prospered the United States.
It's gotten much more complicated since beaver pelts went out of.
Well, Yeah, for sure. And there's newer technologies.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of sort of where we find ourselves, we do find ourselves in a very, I think, advantageous position. We're already intertwined with the U.S. economy, so greatly connected, and there's so many strong relationships, and that's only intensifying. At the same time, Europe is turning towards North America more and more so than it ever has, and for a number of different reasons, and the invasion being predominantly the one that's most obvious. But even the economic ties are beginning to strengthen, and they're coming together, I think, more closely, which is, I think, a development that's kind of intensified as of the last year, and one would expect that to continue. And Canada has some of those resources in the interest, but we have the like-minded, similar interest in sustainability and longer term, and about building those supply chains as relationships as opposed to transactions. I mean, one of the things about supply chains is a lot of it is just, it's conceived under a notion of transactions, low cost efficiency, and the notion that it's always available. That is different in the critical mineral context. The minerals are not available. They won't be available at the demand and at the supply scope that's required. So that isn't I can just go buy it on the spot market. It's I need to build a relationship.
And they're finite.
And
As you
Yeah.
point out, there is a limit and a great deal of energy that has to be expended in some cases to get those minerals to market.
And can I say, just
Sorry
not
to
just
interrupt.
finite, because one thing we haven't talked so much about is, and there's an opportunity for continuous innovation in how to produce them, because I think both countries, we're looking at geothermal brine, we're looking at remining opportunities, co-production,
Right.
and there's a tremendous amount of opportunity on the research demonstration kind of side for public capital to help create the new technologies that are going to help find more sustainable ways to produce these minerals.
And
as well.
putting aside intellectual property, there's no property in good ideas, as the old legal maxim goes, and especially in the race to deal with
Yeah.
climate change. Diane Francis mentioned carbon sequestration, and I think batteries is the big, it seems to be the big goal that everybody is chasing, but we haven't quite cracked that yet. We can't run battleships or even our house heating in the Great White North on batteries just yet.
Not just yet. I mean, that we haven't touched it, but a component of that is recycling and circular. So, I mean, the one thing about the battery economy that's emerging and energy security that's emerging through mineral security is that there is an opportunity as we look up into the generation beyond where a component of the supply will come from circular economy, from reuse. Samir's mentioned, mining from waste or mining from repurposing existing facilities and, if you will, brownfield. That is opportunity for sure. We heard from E3 this morning, but we also recognize that, 15 years from now, there'll be batteries that are leaving vehicles that have been on the road for 15 years, and there's an opportunity to reuse that material. And to a certain degree, metals can be recycled almost indefinitely if done properly. So there's innovation potential there. And then there's new supply relationships and supply chains that'll emerge from that as well. So we as government, I think, have to kind of move quickly to incentivize that behavior, but also to kind of make sure that the regulatory environment doesn't create frictions. We're moving recycled goods and end-of-life goods and looking at that impact. So that's another part of the strategy that we're looking at. It's another place where we can work with partners who are thinking in the same way.
And the innovation piece, I think, is key. There's so much just incredibly impressive research going on in both our countries. Waste to energy is one that is accelerating and taking on more steam, pardon the pun. And I know we're getting sort of near the end of our allotted time here, but the security regulations, the public expectations and demands that we are placing on people at a time where we may be approaching, I think most economists believe we are approaching recession. This is also inevitably going to impact on our ability to accelerate both innovation, investment, critical minerals, and put even greater emphasis, I would suggest, on incentivizing, to use your word, Jeff, as opposed to punishment, such as increasing taxes. And not to go down that road, but this is a real part of the discussion, I think, as we enter difficult, dark economic times. And so, if you would, not to end on a negative note, but how do our countries collectively face that reality? And is that going to require, for lack of a better term, an appetizer suppressant on some of the ambition around what we're talking here in this overall transition?
Jeff, it's okay. Do you want me to go first on that one? Okay. You know, on our side, we've looked hard at that question. You know, it's a really uncertain economic time. Today's CPI print had some kind of promising kind of signals in it, but it's just one print, and so you know, we're always looking for showing that signs that inflation's abating, and we know that the Federal Reserve on our side is doing all that it can there. As we look at what our legislative efforts have unlocked, what we see across a series of laws that the president has passed, and is that we now have a generational amount of public investment dollars, capital going into physical infrastructure for the clean energy transition and for the digital economy. And we've provided a level of certainty and regulatory clarity that can now mobilize private capital and bring capital in a way that's going to boost our long-term potential and ease price pressures in the longer term. So, you know, in many ways, we know it's a very uncertain environment, but we think we're well positioned to move through this, especially as we've talked about. A lot of the trends we're talking about here are long-term trends, so it's about how do you move through the economic cycle but still remain on that longer-term trend line of expanding productive capacity for these mineral and these clean energy supply chains. I mean, I think the other thing is U.S. business investment has remained pretty resilient throughout this year. It increased every quarter in 2022. So we're still seeing capital formation, especially in these sectors, and large announcements, at least on the U.S. side, on batteries, on minerals, on you know, solar. So we're not overly pessimistic yet.
No, that's good. I mean, apropos of this discussion, a 25% increase in investment between our two countries, or trade on the subject of mining. Jeff, maybe last word to you, and then we'll go to the audience for a few questions before we wrap up.
Yeah, I'm not a economic policy expert in terms of inflation, but I would certainly say I think government's using a mix of measures, and we're looking at, you know, trying to continue to stimulate the investment in the areas, whether it's through, you know, clean energy tax credits, or whether it's through supporting transition for workers and investments. But it's a mix of things, and I think it strikes me that with the volatility happening and the uncertainty about when inflation's going to kind of erode or slow, we need to kind of continue to make smart decisions and continue to kind of make the right investments that look at the long range of where the trends are going. It's clear we're going to transition to electric vehicles. It's clear that you know, moving electricity around our respective countries is going to remain an important dimension. So I think infrastructure investments that move along those chains tend to support a longer term view. The continued volatility in terms of prices and consumers and what's happening at a more retail level is a little bit more complex. Some of that's the supply chain reorienting and re-engineering it. It's the rebound of the pandemic. There's a number of factors that over the next number of years we're going to see our way through.
That's a really interesting point on the necessary infrastructure, which I'm hoping that there are really smart people like yourselves who are being part of that planning, because the perpetual election cycles that both our countries live in make it very difficult for the type of long-term planning you're referencing. So folks, some questions from the audience. Yes, here in the front.
My name is Abigail Hunter. I work for the Quebec government in our office in Washington. First, I want to say I've worked with both your teams and really appreciate the partnership. ADM Levante mentioned this, that provinces have jurisdiction in Canada over these mineral resources. And then you also mentioned the need for government coordination in the long build-up for these supply chains to be secure, efficient, and competitive. I want to ask both of you, what role do you think states and provinces could play in helping that efficiency so that our manufacturers will actually be able to build these supply chains out ethically, efficiently, competitively, and then be able to be eligible for the IRA tax credits in the next couple of years. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, from a domestic point of view in Canada, there's a working group that we chair as the federal government with all the provinces. Most of the provinces have advanced critical mineral strategies. You would know that Quebec's is probably the most advanced of the provinces, with its own features of how a government is participating, what the regulatory construct is, what the investments are. So the things that we are doing federally tie together with what the provincial governments are doing in Canada. So we, from a national government point of view, have put out a critical mineral strategy. It went out for comment. The first place we consulted and actually worked to update and build the strategies with our provincial partners, recognizing the jurisdiction. But I mean, I think as we kind of extend that out, the similar conversations happening around the world, sort of you look at Indigenous governments, we look at state level governments, subnational governments, and you look at the conversation and it's still carrying itself through to make sure that there is that right level of collaboration that maintains the ability for governments to work together.
And then on our side, we have our bipartisan infrastructure law that we enacted. So through all the implementing infrastructure that we've set in place here at the federal level, we are doing a lot to build state capacity. We've had a summit recently on improving project delivery that was designed to kind of figure out what are best practices that can be shared between states and between the federal government and states on how to improve project kind of permitting, timelines, delivery across a range of infrastructure assets. And we've also set up kind of state level kind of coordinators like at each governor's office to work with us to help really drive more efficient collaboration. And again, like lifting up best practices so we can start having some similar regimes in states around the country.
I'm going to go to the back, Alex. We'll take two, but please make them really quick.
Okay, I'll try. I'm Paula Stern, I used to chair the U.S. International Trade Commission, and was involved in a panel that I moderated last week at the Washington International Trade Association on semiconductor technology. And we're sitting here thinking about the future, which is wonderful, but I'm thinking about the most immediate future, which is how will China retaliate? What will they do in the face of our semiconductor export control announcements with regard to these very critical minerals? That's one of the speculations there. But we know that Xi and Biden, we hope, will be sitting down together in the next week or so in Bali. So I'm just wondering, from your wonderful perspective, the short term, where do these critical minerals fit in our dialogue? As we're not, if we are decoupling, how do we constrain the costs to the globe?
I'm going to bootleg another question in too, just so we can finish it up.
Yeah, thanks. We've had Alex Panetta, CBC News. We had a conversation about the broad challenges ahead. So much need over the coming years to develop so many different types of minerals, and the requirement of countries cooperate. But I'm just wondering if we could just narrow the conversation for just a second, talk about what your most immediate priorities are on this continent. Are there specific initiatives, specific minerals, and specific opportunities for partnership that you spend most of your time thinking about?
That's a great connective question because semiconductors is obviously be part of that thought process.
Yeah. I mean, look, on with China, we have been very clear that we recognize that there are some areas where we are looking for and want to cooperate with China, and there are some places where we're going to be in a more competitive posture. We maintain strong dialogue, right? Like the president is hopefully going to be sitting down, and but we recognize that there are ways in which they have invested and mobilized state capital in ways that has really hurt the rules-based international order, hurt market-based development. And so our response here is to, and has been, to invest in our own self, invest in our domestic strength, because we know they can't compete with our innovation economy, our strong IP protections. And so we know we've been very consistent saying we welcome the competition. It's a competition we think we're going to win, because the U.S. has the best workers, the best companies, and the best investment climate at the end of the day, especially for these high technology industries that are poised to really grow, like semiconductors and microelectronics, quantum computing, and into the clean energy space. On the second question of like some specific areas, you know, on our side, with the American Battery Materials Initiative that we announced, we're really focused on like 5 minerals in particular, because we think they're so critical to the transition: lithium, cobalt, manganese, graphite, nickel, and the specific areas of cooperation that I think you heard us say earlier include, you know, ways to look at defense cooperation, defense supply chains, defense-related investments is definitely one area. The second is in multilateral fora, whether it's the Mineral Security Partnership or the G7 and the Partnership for Global Investment. Those are places where we're working together to mobilize our resources to put together, to really help advance deals overseas, right, to secure the mineral rights and the processing that is so important to the companies headquartered in both of our countries, and to making the goods that the consumers need in our country as well. So those are 2 places I'd point you.
Jeff, last word to you.
Yeah, thank you. On the China question, I think that's a complicated question. It's going to play itself out. If we knew where it was going, I think we'd all have a much greater deal of comfort here in the room about how it expands. But I'll leave that to perhaps China and North America experts. On where we're working with the U.S. on a more, Samira's mentioned most of it. So we have a working group we have a supply chain working group led under the White House and the Privy Council office. So B2B industry engagement, we've been holding seminars between companies in the United States, companies in Canada, talking about investment opportunities, about projects that are early stage and advanced stage that need the capital and need offtakes and abilities to work together. We've been working on R&D and innovation. Samira's mentioned some of the targeted minerals, so battery recycling activities, about rare earth and magnet areas where we have, I think, particular dependencies. And then defense as an example. And then I wouldn't, my scientists would be very disappointed if I didn't point to our geological research and data exchanges between the U.S. Geological Survey and the Canadian Geological Survey, where we have a lot of work on the exploration side so that we can understand the mineral potential, the resources we have, such that, when they are potentially available for development, that it's very targeted and we can increase the return potential and lower the risk.
And on the recycling side, I didn't get a chance to talk to you much about that, but in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have money we're putting out for grants and demonstration projects on battery recycling, but also on battery materials. We just issued the first set of grants last month on the battery materials side, but that battery materials side is so key to development of that circular economy. So that is a place where we see a lot of opportunity.
Samira and Jeff, thank you very much for your wonderful, informed comments and for being here and making time to participate.